Okay, looks like everything's taking along well, and I will make this public, and then if I can get a shareable link, we will post it to Discord. And it has a better thumbnail this time, which I'm pleased about. So today we're going to be talking about the Syndicate, which is one of the oldest and most powerful alliances in politics and war. And they also have some ties to cyber nations. And I was going to say nation states, but I don't think so. So yeah, they're a very old and famous group. And they're still reasonably powerful today. I think in the past we would have put them easily in like the top 3 alliances for like 2014 to 20... Maybe not 2014, 2015 to 2021, 22, they would have been top 3. Now they're probably top 3, but it's more debatable. Personally, I would still put them in the top 3. I'd say Rose eclipse the Syndicate and then everyone else. But I don't know, some people might replace Syndicate with TKR or Event Horizon. I don't know about any others though, so they're still a very fierce contender. They have a pretty cool wiki page, just like Rose, but unfortunately I think it's kind of dull, just like Rose. So one of their members gave me this, which is really cool. It's basically a personal history or an opinion piece by Zed, who is one of TS's founders, I believe. And I've heard some other stuff from a variety of TS members, which will try and inject where possible to flesh out the history. And also I'll try and contextualize some of the history, because alliance histories I found often portray things only one way. Like they sort of just lack context. Even Rose, which I felt was like they were trying very hard to be unbiased, or give the appearance that they were unbiased. The way that they misled people in their wiki page was just by leaving things out. Like that was how they changed the narrative. They just don't mention things. And I imagine TS will be somewhat similar. So where to begin? Actually, first let's find out if anyone's around. Okay, so that's cool. So you're messing with Green. Yeah, so they've owned Green for many, many, many moons. And I think they'll prioritize it even more soon with the color trade block changes, if those go through. They've already raised the bonus. Yeah, let's see. Color trade blocks are very much a Cyber Nations thing that's sort of left over in PNW. I think, which one do we want to start with? Do we want to start with the wiki page, which I fear is going to be kind of long, or do we want to start with this, which is more of an opinion piece? I think probably the wiki is more useful, because I have a feeling most of this will just be fluff, so we can run through it real quick, and then we can compare and contrast how that history is portrayed to the public versus internally to TS people. And this, I think, was made in 2018, so like it's not as new as this probably is. So there might be some revisions that they've made in this official one that they haven't made in this. So it was founded in 2014 in November, so it's a little bit later than Rose, Guardian, and the rest. I think this is after the first global. It was under the leadership of Partisan, Mustang, and Cynic. Top 15, early treaty with VE. Yeah, so they were a protectorate of VE. It's a strange way of wording it, but that's what they were. And then they protected Black Knights. So they were protected by a CN alliance. They had a bunch of CN people from MI6, and then they were protecting even more CN people. And I think TS, or Frontier Sword Alliance, or whatever, the FSA, the Frontier Sword Alliance was mostly PNW natives, or like it just wasn't majority CN. So this is like one of the first clashes between those two groups. Yeah, so FSA attacked them, they turned on them, and they turned and blew them up, and then Elysian League merged into them. This is a really weird war because from everything, I think I might have encountered the leader once. From everything I know about them, they're basically like a large group of non-Discord, non-forum players, and so they just got completely obliterated by TS and BK, which were nowhere near as skilled as they are now, but were still a big like step up. So this was kind of, it's misleading. FSA had like higher ranking, I think, but they were much weaker. We can have a look at it briefly. Yeah, okay. So it's not telling us too much. We go to the pre-war rankings. Yeah, and FSA just collapsed entirely. Like they were gone. I think I messed up the rankings. Okay, no, I'm not doing that. That's too much of a mess. Okay, so 19th of May 2015, the Great VE War broke out as a result of a series of leaks. Great VE War, one of my favorite wars, very fun. Guardian, Seven Kingdoms, and Mensa HQ tried to conquer the world and failed. These leaks indicated, so we're trying to destroy VE and use Rose as unwitting pawns. On the third day of the war, the Syndicate entered the war, declaring on Guardian and defense of VE, along with several other alliances. I didn't know they fought in this war, but I guess that makes sense. Despite early losses, the tide of war turned and carried the Viridian Entente to victory. They were always going to win. They had 80% of the game on their side. Aftermath of the Great VE War. The Great VE War saw a toppling of the then dominant powers in Orbis. This resulted in a power vacuum which the Syndicate and Viridian Entente stepped in to claim. So Guardian had proven itself to be capable and competent, and graceful in defeat. Well, yeah, I mean, Seven Kingdoms was the one plotting the war. Guardian had a series of other dramas and crises that they were dealing with. The Syndicate therefore moved to foster deeper relations. Yeah, okay, so they're basically picking apart the remnant of the coalition that had just been defeated. Viridian Entente was more ambitious and still sought to form a treaty with UPN, which was at the time the second strongest alliance in the game. Also, this is the justification for Paragon, which it used to feature heavily on the Rose page, but they removed it. So it's interesting that the Syndicate still has it up there. So the treaty would have created a political axis around which the Syndicate and their allies would have orbited, putting the Syndicate in the backseat of a stronger union. If the treaty were a success, Rose would be isolated and eventually rolled. However, if the treaty were rejected, Viridian Entente intended to treaty Rose instead. This treaty policy created tension between the Syndicate and VE for two reasons. Firstly, if the treaty were a success, then the Syndicate would be disempowered, no longer an equal partner but a radial alliance, and secondly, UPN took a long time replying to VE. And while this was happening, the Syndicate had to request that its own allies did not treaty Rose, as this would result in complications if and when Rose would eventually be rolled. So they were very much a realpolitik alliance, even in those very early days, looking out for their own self-interest and trying to prioritize and maximize their political power. Eventually, matters came to a head after a series of heated exchanges between the Syndicate and VE. A compromise was reached. VE abandoned its UPN treaty plans and formed a bloc with the Syndicate and Rose called Paragon. I'm trying to remember how this worked. I don't think they gave an ultimatum to VE. I believe the ultimatum was to Rose. So they said, like, Rose either signed up to this thing or Rose would be rolled, and Syndicate would do nothing to help them. And also, alternatively, not only would Rose be rolled, but the Syndicate might be rolled later by a UPN VE axis. So they form a bloc called Paragon. It solved the immediate issue. But yeah, it had strained relations between Syndicate and VE. Because VE really did prefer UPN to Rose. Rose back then was more of a chaotic entity. They had a lot of alliances didn't like them, which I'm not quite sure why. So from this point on, the relationship between Impero and Partisan began to deteriorate rapidly. For the first time, the Syndicate had started considering moving away from Viridian Entente. I think they were considering it for a while, sure. As soon as Paragon came into existence, onlookers observed that there would eventually be a war between Paragon and Covenant, which was at that time the other dominant force in Orbis. A long term. Oh, well, I mean, if that war did happen, then Paragon just wins. Like, Paragon was an obscenely powerful bloc compared to the Covenant. So, long term, the Syndicate had begun the process of moving away from the Viridian Entente, but such a move was impossible in the short term, with war looming. With this in mind, the Syndicate set out planning the coming war with the intention of winning the inevitable war quickly. Yeah, because it was an easy war. The plan was to fake rising tensions between Paragon and the Paperless Alliances, ARG and Test, to disguise a military buildup, and then once at full strength, Paragon and the Paperless Alliances would turn on the Covenant, reducing them rapidly. However, this plan was never to come to fruition. This is one of the most interesting plans in PNW history, period, because like people sort of dismiss it like as a one-time thing, but one, it was very rare. Like, you don't tend to see the faking of tensions. It's a very dishonorable move. But it has happened multiple times now. And the fact that these alliances tried it, Rose, Syndicate, etc., that informed other alliances that they were later fighting against and said, who said that, well, they might be faking tensions again in a series of other wars. And so this really damaged their, like, trust and, like, reliability. I'm losing the word, but it damaged their reputation in a huge way. And it applies to the Great War, it applies to Trail of Tears in that era, and it also applies to way later wars, even in like 22, 23, because they just can't trust that, yeah, militarization to deal with pirates is legitimate. Yeah, I think people were even mentioning this when TKR milled up to deal with Church of Adam. Like, that is how impactful this one instance was, that it affected them and everyone they became to be tied to after. So Cynic logs and withdrawal from Paragon. While still in its early stages, logs relating to the plan were leaked by Cynic, one of the founders of the Syndicate, due to a grudge he held against Partisan. The logs were leaked to VE and the UPN, and then spread quickly across Orbis, causing much upset. Cynic is just an agent of chaos. He's leaked a number of things. He stole a number of banks. Yeah, he's probably one of the greatest creators of content in PNW, just for how much he shakes up the board and then leaves. Viridian Entente had previously said it did not wish to work with ARG or Test, and so they perceived Partisan to have been going behind their back. V, though, was a very weird alliance back then. I think they were pragmatic, but they were probably also just kind of weird and inconsistent about their strategies. A lot of the old CN alliances were like that, where they have hang-ups about some things and not about others. So in a forceful post in the VE embassy on the Syndicate forums, ancient stuff, if they're using Syndicate forums, Imperial suggested that Partisan was to step down from his position. And after discussing the matter internally, the members of the Syndicate expressed their continued confidence and support for Partisan. From everything I've heard from the Syndicate, and even from Rose and VE people, this, again, was one of the greatest blunders in PNW history. So if VE did not request Partisan to step down, or did not demand that he step down, which I think suggested is the wrong word here, if they didn't demand he step down, then the Syndicate would have kicked him out themselves. They were already on the way to doing that internally, from everything that I've heard. And yet the only reason they didn't was because another alliance tried to pressure them into doing it. So it was stubbornness. And then from this, Partisan would go on to create absolutely insane blocks and spheres and stuff. So PNW history would have been altered greatly if they'd just been a bit less forceful. So on August 8th, 2015, the Syndicate cancelled its MDOAP with Viridian Entente and withdrew from Paragon Block. 3 days later, on August 11th, the Syndicate announced a new treaty with Mensa HQ, and this treaty created the core of a new power block containing the Syndicate, Mensa HQ, and Guardian, i.e. Syndisphere. And yeah, they included BK and TKR. On the very same day, Viridian and Rose added Vanguard as a new third party to Paragon Block, and Vanguard was just a Rose Protectorate, with some elements from, was it Umbrella or MPO or whatever? The people that would come to form MPO and PNW. The Proxy War. So while Mensa's treaty strengthened the Syndicate's position, it also resulted in V and Rose perceiving the Syndicate as a newly bolstered threat. Rose and Mensa had a complicated history of both in-game and out-of-character hostility, and this, coupled with the Syndicate's history with VE, seemed to make war an inevitability. Rumors of war spread rapidly around Orbis. Yeah, okay. I'm just going to skip through some of this because we've covered it in the Rose history. And I want to understand what Syndicate's view of this was. Yeah, okay, so they got a leak that Rose was going to attack them. They attacked at the same time and ruined their blitz. And they allowed Mensa to preempt Vanguard. Yeah, I don't think they're really explaining the amount of... the fact that this was basically just a proxy attack. Like, regardless, I mean, both sides wanted to roll each other. That's unquestioned. But the idea that Syndicate was just chilling defensively and then preemptively attacked is kind of ridiculous. They were trying to figure out how best to start the war, and they thought that proxying Vanguard was the most effective method. There's not a ton more to that. So meanwhile, Viridian Entente and their North American and their allies North American Confederacy attacked Guardian. You couldn't get away with that alliance now. But they're the NAC, so I think they're a member of Covenant or something. Anyway, in response, the Knights Radiant BK Coalition test countered Viridian Entente. Yeah, okay, this is just an escalation of the war, isn't it? Okay, yeah, so they fought, the game got rolled back because of hacking, and yeah, later Rose and VE surrendered to the Syndicate. So by all measures, the war was a huge success for the Syndicate. Immediately after the war, Syndicate status within the game improved enormously. The allies of the Syndicate were bound together in the common fellowship of success. That is a very common theme, that Syndicate is basically the alliance of, for lack of a better term, winning. It's a huge part of their character. And when they lose, you can tell, because their whole alliance culture shifts a little bit. Yeah, non-Discord is really tough to make into a real alliance. I'm trying to think if there's any successful non-Discord alliance. I think TFP is probably the closest. They were known non-Discord for extremely long time. And I'm just going to try and find... I have the war stats from Proxy War, I think. And if I do, then I can share them. It might take me a minute. Proxy War. That's... I got the Silent War stats. Papers, please. Yeah, I can't find Proxy. I think I have Proxy somewhere. Anyway, regardless. We will continue. But I want to speed this up because I don't just want to read through the whole page, I want to get to the heart of what the Syndicate did here. Yeah, so TS was kind of different in how they built spheres compared to almost any other coalition in the game's history, I'd argue, until modern PNW. So, yeah, so in very early PNW, each alliance had individual treaties and operated independently. Right? They all considered themselves to have an independent foreign policy. And then when Paragon and Covenant formed, all those alliances were in the bloc, but there was no adversity to tying outside of the bloc. This is why Proxy War was such a mess, because Covenant was tied to both of the sides. And so when Syndicate was building its sphere, it had a different mentality. It didn't want alliances pursuing sort of individual FA policies, and it didn't want them tying outside the sphere. So if you picture the game, you can think of it as a series of, like a giant web of interconnecting MDPs and ODPs, and then Syndicate off by itself in its own little corner with all MDOAPs, or protectorates. So it was just a red block, a red pentagon, sitting off in the corner, while the rest of the game was a multicolored haze of treaties. And when that came to war, then the Covenant Paragon coalition was very slow moving, because every alliance on that side kind of had to be convinced. Whereas on the Syndicate side, if any one member was attacked, it instantly triggered all the other MDOAPs, dragged everyone in immediately, and they were a much more coordinated force. And that also reflected in the political discussions. Like if Rose and VE were arguing, the entirety of the Syndicate would dogpile on one of them. Whereas if the Syndicate didn't really argue amongst itself, and when it did, then when other people tried to intervene, then the Syndicate just sort of pushed them off and said, "We don't care." Right? It's an internal dispute, and so the Syndicate really operated more as a single. Their bloc operated more like a single alliance than a sphere, I guess. They were the first, I would say, argue the first true bloc in the game, and that was as they were being called Syndisphere. So, yeah. Oh, and then Obsidian Order formed, which BK and TKR sort of split off from the Syndicate, and were trying to do something dynamic TM, but it didn't really work, because Syndicate and BK had a lot of disagreements, and the alliance that brought them together consistently was the Syndicate. So, yeah. Meanwhile, the Syndicate pursued close relations with Seven Kingdoms and Alpha, which would ultimately culminate in two new treaties. Okay, yeah, so they signed Syndicate and Alpha. I thought there were disputes here. Maybe those come later. Anyway, as the dust settled, it became clear that the post-war world was substantially changed. Okay, so this is the formation of Parakov. Yeah, after the war, Syndisphere was extremely powerful. So UPN and VE teamed up to create Paracovenant. Yep, so Parakov planned to attack them. Yep, Syndicate and them tried to negotiate an end to the war. Didn't work, war broke out, and I think Syndicate just wins. Yeah, so I think they lost mainly because of incompetence, if I remember correctly. Like, they had the numbers, and the UPN VE tie was meant to give them the coordination that they lacked up until this point, and that the Syndicate had by virtue of its structure. But unfortunately, it didn't really work, because I think they were still using naval attacks when the Syndicate had switched to planes or something like that. Yep, and after the war, Cindersphere was like at its zenith or at its height. They were basically untouchable because they were small. They were, relatively speaking, they were elite, and they got to pick who they wanted on their side. Um, and there was no such thing as like downsizing to avoid getting rolled back then. And even if there were, Syndicate wasn't going to do it. Um, and hegemony was such a like a nebulous concept back then because it wasn't like the great terror nowadays. It's more well, in CN you had a hegemon, and then a coalition formed to take down the hegemon and replace them. And then that group reigned as hegemon until the opponent could take them out and replace them. So when UPN became the hegemon in PNW in its very early days, like they were the top dog. They were the people that needed to be defeated, and then they were by Guardian, Seven Kingdoms, and Rose, and Mensa or whatever. And then Mensa and Guardian, Seven Kingdoms, they were the new hegemon. They were the top dogs. And when VE came into the game, well, they got worried. They got scared. They tried to take them out, rule the game again. Didn't work, and they lost. And then Paragon became the new hegemon, and it would be up to Covenant to take them down. Covenant wasn't able to, and Paragon dissolved. And so now in Syndicate's view, they were the new hegemon. And, well, sort of. And, because there's a weird perception there where they're like, well, we're small, so we can't really be a hegemon. But they were the top dog, right? So they were the new hegemon, and it was the game's duty to take them down. It was not their duty to downsize. And you still see elements of this in the narratives perpetuated by the whale alliances. Most of the whales come from Cindersphere. So the whales will say, it's not our job to sort of help newer players, or it's not our job to give up power or to break up the big whale alliances like Grumpy or Guardian. And it's not our job to weaken ourselves. It's your job to catch up. So, yeah, in essence, get good. Like, that is the tagline of Cindersphere, or was for a long period. And, yeah, that is the heart of it. But let's see. Yeah, so they read at their peak. Aside from this, Syndicate's economic strength had been stunted by continual war and needed a prolonged peace. Would target for re-amelioration. I think he means rapprochement. It's interesting. So, yeah, even though they won the war, they were still afraid of losing out economically. Probably because, yeah, they were only like 30% of the game. And all economies in the game back then were like way worse than they are now. Rum War and Mensa Vanguard raids. Throughout January 2016, tensions began to emerge between Cindersphere and ARG as a result of continued raiding on the part of ARG. Eventually, in a move encouraged by the leader of Rose Abbas, a few prominent members from ARG split off and created a new mini pirate alliance called Political Pirates. And the Political Pirates mass raided Guardian. Interesting. Abbas, by his own admission, in like radios and stuff, hired a lot of pirates to attack Cindersphere pretty consistently. I guess the logic was that if the mercenaries destroyed more than they were being paid, then like there was a good ROI for Rose. Like that infra wouldn't have to be destroyed by Rose in the next war. So while ARG and S7 Award ARG, a group of Mensa HQ members decide to raid Vanguard on their own accord. Okay, I didn't know that Vanguard split from Paragon after Proxy. That's a very, not moralistic, but it's a very ideological move. Okay. Why is this in the Syndicate history? Okay, so there was some more mercenary stuff between Syndicate and Rose. It ended with reparations. This wouldn't appear in Alliance histories now. It would just be like a small dispute. Like you won't see any of that in later histories. 168-day war. Oh, okay. So that's the context. So that small incident sort of ballooned into a bunch of militarization. Then it started a 168-day war, which I feel like this war is more related to Rose. Like it's interesting to see how things played out and what the context is, like running out of munitions and stuff. But it's not sort of a big event, and that's where the history ends. Damn, 168 days is where it ends. That's like, when was 168-day war? Because that is so long ago. It's 2016. So they haven't updated their history in 8 years. That is ridiculous. Wow, I'm finally moving at a normal pace. It's only been 30 minutes. I'm pleased. If you make a comment, by the way, I can read it pretty quick. But okay, let's start with Zed. Because I feel his history is going to be way more interesting. And no, I'm not going to read it all. I'll attempt to read most of it. So some of you remember when Partisan gave you walls of text. Some more of you might remember when I gave you walls of text, and what follows is me giving you another wall of text. Okay, well they got a good sense of humor. Yeah, it's from his perspective. Mostly cover the time period when he became the head of foreign affairs sometime in late 2016. Okay, so it's... I don't know how much it's going to expand on the previous history. Then from... Maybe it'll take us to 2018, so it'll give us like a few years. So after the global war, that came to be known as silent because no one posted official declarations of war, but they did manage to get like a forum thread to 50 pages or something, which is apparently still the record. So someone needs to beat that. However, some additional prior context will be given when needed for context and clarity. Nice. One of them actually knows what context is. One of the history writers for the top alliances, I mean. So as a caveat, all the opinions of alliances and players in this piece are uniquely Zed's and reflections of his thoughts at the timing of the events in question. They do not represent any current official TS stance or personal opinion, nor do they reflect any meaning on current events or policy. They should just put that at the start of the Rose one, and then write a truly fun history for Rose. So TS around the time of Papers, Please was a colossal titan of the game, but one which was badly in need of a new direction and challenge, and perhaps beginning to show decay. In other words, they were winning too much. They'd grown bored with how much they were winning. I think that was like the 4th or 5th global they'd won in a row, and Papers, Please was their attempt to dismantle the largest whale alliance in the game. So if you thought about it today, it would be like if Eclipse rolled Grumpy out of the game and then merged Rose, or then signed Rose. That would be the... Oh, and then signed Rose, Singularity, and what's it called? Actually, yeah, maybe if all the Napt Alliance signed a treaty, and then Grumpy disbanded, that would be the proper context for this. That would be accurate. So yeah. To understand the statement properly, you need to understand the context of the game with TS starting from foundations at that time. So So they came from MI6, and then they created an invasion alliance. Outsides, personalities, amazing talent, and a lot of risk. I.e., they were like agents of chaos in in CN from everything I've heard. They were extremely active, um, and also extremely sort of dramatic, and they hated the MPO. And so when they came to this game, they were way more ideological than any other alliance in PNW. Um, with every other alliance, then I think they were bringing more from CN than than they were injecting new stuff. Whereas Syndicate didn't like how CN worked, from my understanding. And they wanted to change PNW for the better and address some of the systemic issues of CN. I don't know if they did that, but I think that was the general vibe that they were trying to portray. So some of you may remember the strategy known as Ground Zero, created by Jessica Rabbit, set the tone for the meta of military and tiering strategy. I do not remember Ground Zero. Ground planes only. Okay, yeah. So they invented planes only, which was like the best military strategy in the game, because it would compress your score, which I guess you can't really do as easily now. So yeah, in the past, then your infrastructure and city score was lower. So pretty much all your score would be in military units. And planes were, I think they were one of the lowest score units, but they were also like the only military unit that really mattered. And so if you just compressed your score by only having planes, then you could attack nations 5 or 10 times smaller than you. And even if the opponent like attacked with ground forces, and back then ground forces could like limit the number of planes you could use by like 33%. Even though that's like devastating, then like planes only still worked. It's still brutally effective. Yeah, all that you needed is a higher coordination or more people. If you have both, it's an easy sweep. But if you just have one, then you have a good chance of winning. Or closer tiering also allows you to win. Okay, so... Oh yeah, and it was also great economically. There was a huge risk of raiders, though. That was one of the only downsides, which is, I think, why Rose proxied them so much with raiders. Because, yeah, it was so easy. I think the economic logic of countering that, too, was that even if Syndicate lost... trying to think of a lot of money back then. But actually, we'll do it now. Even if Syndicate lost 500 mil a week, not a week, 500 mil a month from raiders because they were on planes only, that didn't matter, because by reducing their military by 3 slots in all of their cities, that produced like 1 billion in net revenue. So 500 mil net profit, it's fine. Yeah, so these gains allowed TS in its early days to form a sphere of its own and make another high-risky play to break away from their former protectors and stewards, V and Rose, to create what would become the most influential hegemony in PNW history, even one that bared the name Syndisphere. As an alliance, we fostered many extremely successful protectorates. Here's the thing. Like, Syndicate was pioneering some great strategies, and they were very good at the game, on average. But I think he's assigning more accomplishments to Syndicate than they probably deserve. So BK and TKR, were they helped by Syndicate? Absolutely. Would they have easily become top 10 alliances in their own right without Syndicate? Absolutely. BK at the time when it formed was one of the highest tech alliances in the game. TKR, as much as they will deny it, has ties to Mushroom Kingdom, which is one of the most powerful alliances in CN history, period. I'm pretty sure like MI6 doesn't even come close to how powerful Mushroom Kingdom is, from my understanding of the game. And so, in some sense, it's like a bulldog saying, oh, like, I'm the leader of the pack, and there is a baby, like, wolf right there. And it's like, yes, you are. No, you are definitely the leader of the pack, 100%, for the next 6 months. They had some leviathans on their side. So to say that they were only the product of Syndicate is, or that they were even majority responsible for helping them is ridiculous. Um, though yeah, Treasure Island's still absolutely broken. Um, that generated I think it buffed their revenue by 40%. Like that's a big part of why Syndicate got so far ahead of its rivals. Without Treasure Island, um, the game would be an extremely different place. Most of the whales in the game right now, um, a lot of them have ties to Treasure Island, which is really interesting because if you talk to them about it, they'll say, "Well, we got here through time and experience, and no, you got it through, to be very blunt, like an exploit, in essence. They exploited the fact that treasures were completely broken, and Alex refused to do anything. And so they created a 1,000 member alliance or something, or a 600 member alliance with a 40% revenue bonus. There has never been like a more profitable exploit in the history of the game, except for Nova Riata. Maybe, maybe. I think Treasure Island might have still added more relative wealth to the game than Nova Riata did. In Nova Riata, they were literally spawning in money, or spawning in resources which they were selling for money. Um, anyway, uh, oh, they actually did name it the most influential hegemony in PNW history. Yeah, well, I mean that is one thing. I think their skill did not come in the form of like training the protectorates, which they did reasonably well, but they had good protectorates, and it didn't come necessarily through pioneering all the best strategies. Though they had a few good ones. I think it came from the fact that they were able to negotiate with all of the other members of their sphere and get them on board. And I'd put a lot of that down to Partisan and their leadership team, to be frank. So we'll continue. None of these things would have been possible with the talents and work that several of its leaders had, but that story is one that perhaps follows a similar pattern in the evolution of companies and alliances. I think it's just true for alliances because I think a lot of individual members aren't doing anything. They're just logging in and logging out. And even in Syndicate, which is more active than some, that's still very true. So it's a bit worse than in companies because in a company, presumably everyone has to play some role. So for those of you who remember some of my stories, who remember that I was initially recruited by Partisan no less to be in mine for IA. So while I had some experience in middle FA and Milcom during my senior career, I was most famous and well known there for my IA roles. Well, I mean, IA back then would have been sort of a gatekeeping role because there was a higher quality of applicants. Well, there was a demand for higher quality applicants. You had to be extremely active and you had to be able to use forums and go through this multi-step process and interviews. And setting aside all of that even, then Syndicate only wanted like the best people in the game. The ones that had the skills or the like IRL skills or sort of in-character game knowledge. They wanted to be like the best in the game. And so they only took like the creme de la creme. But that would have also given them a lot of influence because Syndicate had a bunch of people from other alliances infiltrating them or joining to improve their relations because Syndicate was like the most powerful alliance in the game. So that IA role eventually expanded into an FA role, sort of just by knowing all those different people. So there is a somewhat recent exchange in the public server where I got blasted for being an awful recruiter. It is not a claim without merit, however it betrays the context in which I would typically recruit and handle applicants. I came from an elite alliance in CN and generally did not bother much with new players who asked silly questions like what alliance they should join or how not to go bankrupt in the first day. Yeah, so that is very true. It wasn't just him though. You could have swapped him out for any other member of the Syndicate and they'd have done the same thing. TKR, when they were on top, did the exact same thing too. Rose is on top right now, and I think they still do something similar. They've changed their attitude a bit. Now they're like 200 people. But there was a while there where yeah, they wanted people that had coding knowledge or had a good grasp of the game's mechanics or were studying economics or other things that could help them grow the alliance, and that would mean that they wouldn't argue with build plans or other stuff. So I dealt with established personalities, probing them for their viewpoints and giving recommendations to members and governments about their fit in the community. It's why that criticism me in the server is technically valid, but it misses the point about how I perceive the game. He has no disdain for new players, as they were all new players once, but rather a distaste for players who create small micro-alliances and then give up. I think that's just par for the course. I mean, the problem with the elite alliances is they are elitist. Like, that is... It's intrinsic, right? It's what they built. It's a product of that. So, I don't know. I wouldn't throw a shade on him in particular. I would throw a shade at the whole alliance for doing that. But it's not uncommon for alliances when they become the top dog. So shortly after I came to TS, I was given roles in early Milcom. Milcom was, out of all our departments, the least organized and functioning one. Well, yeah, because it only functions once every 3 to 6 months. From there, I eventually became supervisor and later director in that area. Okay, so yeah, he was in like the golden age. Roy Mustang, Manthrax, Partisan, Jessica Rabbit. Yeah, this is like the lineup of TS people. Yeah, this is a very interesting one. I cannot believe that many of these personalities coexisted in the same place. So, this was kind of an insane lineup at the time. Like, even their opponents would probably say that, like, there was a lot of skill. Yeah, and the Syndicate is, like, one of the first cult of personality alliances where they really prop up their leaders. Like, Partisan is more myth than man in the Syndicate. And you could say that about all of their leaders, all of these four. But there was a kernel of truth to it. Like, Partisan is more myth than man because he created, over a long period of time, one of the most successful hegemonies in all of Nation Sim history. So, like, there is a kernel of truth there, and then it balloons into, like, can do no wrong, etc. And then, with Jessica Rabbit, she was an econ genius. She pioneered planes only, and she did a bunch of economic reforms. Great in Milcom. So they're already, like, there's a kernel of truth that they're great at these things. And they were probably one of the best in P&W at the time. But then it balloons into, like, there will never be anyone as good. And it's like, they were good for their day. There's a lot of other people that have come up since that are probably, like, one-to-one more skilled or more knowledgeable or more dedicated or whatever. But at the time, this was insane. So there was a lot more I could say about myself. Almost no one person was good at everything, and no one person completely jived together. I'm trying to remember whose flaws were what. I think Partisan didn't know Econ or Milcom or whatever. I think Jess wasn't great at FA. It was something like that. There were like some really funny blind spots, and you see that in a lot of other games too, where you specialize in one thing and then you're just terrible at everything else. One of the only exceptions to this, I think, is DTC, who he's fine on the econ front because he's constantly trading. Great at Milcom, great with spies, reasonably good at FA. Never seen him do IA. It's the only function, but he messages everyone in wartime, so I would presume he's fine at IA. But you find very few generalists. I'm sort of a generalist, but yeah, I don't know. I do have, I think, some skills I'm better at. So not great at econ. So the Book of Numbers, Census of the Characters. Okay, so he actually goes in depth. about each of the leaders. You would never see this in any other alliance too. About like they it's sort of to some extent explain the cult of personality, so you can buy into it. Um, I think in Rose, if there was anything similar to this, they would just say that Abbas is like involved in a lot of back channels or knows everyone. Like that, it would just be a one line, and then everything else is mystery. And to some extent, that's his character, but to another extent, it's just they don't have that cult of personality. So, Partisan, a founder of the Alliance, is probably the best place to start. He's not. Oh yeah, he's our founder. I was gonna say like that's almost set it up as the founder. Is our founder of the Alliance is probably the best place to start. He's currently back again after a long stint in elite tier paperless groups, and it is no coincidence that people around the world have perceived that TS has reawoken from his return and ascendancy. Yeah, when TS was at its height, back in 2017, then there was a civil war in Syndicate. The Syndicate won the civil war, but at the end, then they went paperless and sort of just went like passive. They went to sleep for like 6-7 months. They grew a lot in that time, became even more powerful, but they were kind of they were perceived as almost useless, and they lost a lot of political power, lost a lot of talent that didn't really feel like their efforts or their skills were being rewarded by being in Syndicate, when TKR and IQ were really keeping up the fight for the game, for who would win the game. So they lost a lot of good people, and then when Partisan returned, then yeah, they felt things were going to change, and I think then they signed Guardian, which reaffirmed that Syndisphere might be coming back, and yeah, and so it speaks a lot to his personality. So in a way that directly fed into his strategy for running FA, a strategy that has been imprinted. Oh, Partisan was a talented recruiter, likely related to his wide array of FA contacts and diplomatic skill. The rest of his ability to manage IA left much to be desired. Yeah, well, yeah, I can imagine. In a way that directly fed into his strategy for running FA, a strategy that has been imprinted and associated with TS for most of its existence. Partisan may have had a deputy, but would manage no other staff. Opposite concerns and confusion with information and back channels were completely non-existent, which allowed Partisan to work his unique magic and leverage people like FA masters ever had, like few FA masters ever had. Okay, that's interesting. I've never heard that, but I guess that makes sense. Yeah, so he was just very clear with people, or at least clear with his own stuff about what they were trying to do, and so that speaks to like a lot of planning. There is a huge lack of planning in the game right now, like insane amounts, even at like the top levels. Like I was talking to a person in Rose recently, and like they will do like scenarios. They were like, if the game was structured in this way, or if this event happened, what would we do? And 80% of the time it's Rose, so they do nothing. But 20% of the time, like that just, it doesn't help them. Like having that plan doesn't actually help. Or a hypothetical plan doesn't help them. But if they just like sat down and wrote a document detailing what was happening right now and how to maybe address it, they would do like 10 times better. It's very little proactive FA from them. There's a lot of hypotheticals, which, and that's not just them, that's a lot of alliances in general. And then there's some that they're older players, so they feel they don't need to plan. They're just like, I'll handle it. No, I'm so experienced. Of course I'll know what to do. Which maybe for small disputes or from how simple FA has gotten in PNW. But yeah, it's a great loss. People don't plan anymore. So upset concerns and confusion with information and back channels were completely non-existent, which allowed so there was no denying that Partisan, through his level of skill and talent, could pull this off and make it look effortless. Oh, Jesus Christ. See what I mean about cult of personality? Most mere mortals would fail miserably trying to replicate his style. Jesus. I've spoken to people that like Adam and stuff that they left Syndicate and they were like briefly head of FA and stuff, and they were like, I was constantly living in his shadow. Like, no other alliance has that, except maybe Rose. It's kind of ridiculous. And yeah, whenever he left, then Syndicate would feel like it was declining, or going backwards. Even now, they'll talk about Tartarus and just be like, Tartarus is so much more easy to play, or like, he's so much more difficult to work with than Partisan. And in some sense, yeah, but Partisan was around for like 10 or 15 years. Like, Tartarus has been around for two. Like, give him time. You can't hold him to the same standard. Uh, Manthrax was, in a way, Partisan's mind mate, perhaps one of the few people who could take Partisan's style of running FA and make it flourish. Okay, whatever. Ensured that our FA did not crash and burn when Partisan departed. So he had to pick up the pieces after Partisan left, and the personality cult didn't know how to handle that. Manthrax was a bit more well-rounded than Partisan, but chiefly had the same style and maneuverability. Yeah, most people would fail to replicate the style. Immediately replicates the style. Towards the end of his time, it was clear that his idealism was an increasingly poor fit with how he had progressed. So he wasn't like Partisan, because Partisan was a realist. Like, he was famous for like popularizing the word realpolitik in the community. So he was different. Yeah, he formed Church of Spaceology. There was discussion of Church of Spaceology hitting TS, and then there was like a major schism later. So I wonder how that played out. I don't think it will be covered in this history. Okay, so he poached people from Syndicate, and that's how relations strained. That makes sense. So Jessica Rabbit was perhaps the most famous TS member in history, save for maybe Partisan. I think they were, but no one knows them now. Like, if you talk to any new player, they just don't know them. Just as Partisan should not do IA, Jess should certainly not do FA. Yeah, okay, that was it. I did remember that correctly. What Jessica could do was Econ and Milcom. For anyone who played the game in 2016-2017, her work needs no elaboration. And for those who missed that period, Jess almost single-handedly created many, many innovations that were absolutely game-breaking to the meta, and she was truly peerless in what she did at the height of her powers. Well, context again, she was leading one of the most powerful sewers in the game, with input from like a dozen of the most talented econ people in the game as well. So, like, you can have like great figures of renown that changed the game, but she also had a lot of advantages. Like, Rose's econ is amazing right now, but I would not put that down to one person in Rose. It's a team effort. So, and particularly in the other interlocutor, it was nearly okay. So there may be times in this piece where my writing comes off as harsh against her. This is not my intent. On balance, Jess was a wonderful person to work with and usually very friendly. Huh? Oh, okay. Interesting. So, Milcom person was also volatile. Makes a lot of sense. That's very standard, actually. Milcom people are just in general very combative, or particularly blunt. Econ too. Like, you're building that wrong. um, yeah, if you want politeness, IA and FA, not Econ and Milcom. Roy Mustang was the straw that stirred the drink. What? He toiled in obscurity to the average person, but was undeniably talented. I have not heard much of this person. Okay, so he was basically a mediator. Like, those are important, but yeah, okay. Chance might not have had Roy's legacy, but as his longtime deputy and later successor, he was just as skilled and talented. If Roy was anonymous, Chance is a figment of your imagination. This is a fantastic history. This is amazing. It's fantastic. Chance may have been even more well-rounded than Roy, and perhaps even more even-keeled and approachable. Well, he would be approachable if he wasn't a figment of your imagination. Yeah, he's not appreciated as much as he should be. In essence, every IA head ever. Or IA person. Timmy and Wilhelm are essentially the Spartan version of Chance in their respective areas. I think they mean military. Okay, so they did well. I think that's the crux of that. Sabriel is the last person in the saga. The last of the High Spartans. I think they mean... Is that what they're calling this lineup? Or is that just their Milcom title? Okay, so it's not a Milcom thing. Because they're talking about FA specialists. So Sabriel is a very different style of FA manager than Partisan and Manthrax. She favored a pragmatic style of realpolitik over their idealism and meta storytelling. Well, I think Partisan was realpolitik, but he shrouded that in idealism and meta storytelling. Like Partisan was how do I put it? He's like Bismarck, but with Kool-Aid. Stalin it's not the right comparison, but Stalin was very like realpolitik in some ways, and he was also shrouded in like the ideology of communism. So Partisan was very realpolitik, but he also shrouded a lot of it in trying to promote game dynamism and reform like CN traditions and stuff. So I think they were probably just very similar to Partisan, from what I'm hearing, but maybe even more realpolitik without that narrative. I think the narrative really helps. Trying to be realpolitik in PNW without the narrative is so punishing. Alliances like Aurora have tried it, and CTO have tried it, and suffered greatly. Without going into much detail, Sabriel suffered limitations on her gameplay due to OOC issues and would sometimes be absent for periods at a time. Insistent on staffing a traditional... Druthers? Why would you include this word? Okay, so she was similar to Partisan in that she was realpolitik, but she didn't have the narrative, and unlike him, she actually had a diplomatic core. I mean, no FA head likes the cards they're dealt. I don't think you'll find anyone that's satisfied with the cards they're dealt, but you sort of just have to play them. So they probably just complained a bunch about that in particular, which it happens. I don't know if that's too representative of what was happening, though. It's interesting. I don't know much about this person, but they actually seem more interesting than some of the others. Just because there's points of contrast with Partisan, which are really interesting. I feel like the modern people in TS are actually way more similar to whoever Sabriel is than Partisan, because there's very little like ideology in PNW now. So she'd probably love like modern PNW, because it is very realpolitik. Like they shroud it a little bit, but not a ton. That's why EVH, which is Aurora and CDO, like a year ago, like they would be absolutely punished for realpolitik moves, but now not so much. The aftermath of Papers, Please. It is at this point that I return to the start of the story. Cereal, who felt as though none of the potential candidates in her diplocores were ready for deputy FFA, was at a loss. Okay, and so she recruited him. Or Chance did, either way. Yeah, Partisan and Manthrax had left. Manthrax was leading Church of Spaceology, who took a different approach of being willing to stir the pot, call people out, and act nihilistic and unattached to anyone and their whims. He was also fighting Grumpy. He was just an agent of chaos. Like a true agent of chaos. He was attacking allies, enemies, everything. The only people he wasn't willing to work with, to my understanding, was Para-Covenant or MPO or whatever they were at that time, IQ. Which if he did would have created even more chaos. I dare say that both of them were hoping that we would do something dynamic, but I think they didn't really imagine we'd go through with it. Have I explained the dynamic ideology? I'm trying to remember even when it started. It's been so long since I've talked about it. I thought about it deeply. So back when there were only two sides, when the game was bipolar, or is in bipolarity, better word for it, then there were people on both sides that called for it to be more dynamic, that they wanted a third sphere, or they wanted individual parties in the two coalitions to have more small wars or different and more interesting disputes. So dynamic TM, as in copyright, became very common. It was half meme and half like genuine attempt. So being dynamic in this instance would be doing something surprising and interesting to freshen up the game. So Partisan was a bit more active in trying to play various sides off of each other, as is his wont, but we were far more skeptical of him than Manthrax. There was intel and access that we shared with Manny that we certainly did not share with Partisan. COS had a lot more of TS, which were fairly liked, whereas Hogwarts had more elements in it which were tainted somehow, like Seb and QZL. I don't know what the issue with Seb is, but QZL, that was clearly a mistake, because as soon as QZL took over, or as soon as QZL joined TS, she stole the bank, which cost them, if I remember, 40 billion. So yeah, well played on that one, on guessing correctly. I've long wondered if they ever looked at us during this period and thought, damn, they have really slipped. I'm so glad I got out, and I feel bad that they seem rudderless and without a clear path other than keeping that heavy crown on their head. I think that is exactly what they thought, and I think the only part that's wrong is this, because that crown had fallen from their head and into the lap of TKR, who now viewed itself as like the ascendant leader of the sphere. And to be blunt, it like did that job pretty well for a brief period. Like they became so powerful pre-Nightfall. So Sabriel had done a very good job maintaining and cultivating a network of allies in the Cindersphere, even if the weight of maintaining that hegemonic structure was ever rising. There was a civil war. Of course it was rising. It didn't go well. Actually, yeah, is this pre-Civil War? Oh, maybe this was pre-Civil War. Doesn't make sense. I thought that this is just before the Civil War or after it. It's pre-VE dissolving. Maybe this is pre-Civil War. Okay, that makes sense. I don't think she could have avoided that then, because that Civil War had been brewing for a while. The first was a re-establishment of the Protectorate scheme, Syndicate, House Stark, and Ragnarok. Very successful program. House Stark is still around. Ragnarok is not, but they've still proved pretty capable for quite a long time. And they were not as neatly tied to CN, I think. They're not PNW natives, I don't think, but they're closer. So the second was the culmination of a project Sabriel had begun that I would take in a different direction. Sabriel had been hard at work establishing diplomatic ties with the two largest unaligned alliances, HBE and Viridian Entente, who, while paired with each other, did not have other ties. I forgot that HBE was tied to VE. Weird. HBE was considerably more reliable than VE. VE is too chaotic, so that's a smart move. HB, however, decided to sign with TKI and MPO around the time Sabriel would step down. HB was one of the first alliances that did like real tiering and 100% taxes, and their tech was also like really impressive. Their politics was just stupid, in a word. Yeah, they probably should have. They should have just signed TS. They were trying to play both sides, and it just failed spectacularly. I wanted an opportunity to cement my own legacy, and I wanted to stake a claim in the web as a bulwark against an attack from MPO. Not only was VE open to the idea, chiefly through Yoda, but some others as well. This is just like, this is such a weird thing. Because back then, like, with how much power they had, being a bulwark against an MPO is probably the wrong way to categorize it. I think they just wanted to roll MPO. Like MPO was the weaker party in that conflict. We're in the game, period. So the VE treaty was to be short-lived. It still surprised me to this day how short it lasted, barely weeks after it was signed. I forgot about it, so yeah. In some respects, perhaps we were almost taken for a ride and dodged a bullet, but in others, there was no real way to really vet what actually went down within the alliance. It turned out that the idea of TS and VE treating each other did not go over so well with some old VE leadership. I mean, probably with some TS leadership. Even now, like, TS still has kind of a grudge against VE. Imperial and Goldie, also backed by Seeker, led a coup against VE that led to the creation of... Okay, that is just the wrong way to portray that. What? Okay, I'm pretty sure that's just wrong. So, for context, VE was a triumvirate, and to my understanding, Yoda, who's one of the triumvirate members, couped the alliance, and the rest of the government left and formed an alliance called the Viridian Entente to, like, defeat the VE coup leaders and restore the alliance. And ultimately what happened, I think, was Yoda realized he'd made a mistake and stepped down, and his team changed VE into Dark Brotherhood, or created a new alliance called Dark Brotherhood, and then VE, the restored alliance, the non-couped version, they got the alliance back and renamed it to Guardians of the Galaxy. So VE died, and a bunch of the whales in VE left and joined Grumpy. So saying that Seeker led a coup against VE, I think is just wrong. He didn't coup VE. He was part of the restoration team, to my understanding. And that's not from Seeker. That is from Yoda and his faction. That is my understanding from what they've told me. So it might be they correct me later, but I think this is just wrong and misleading. And Imperial, I think, has come back to the game once or twice and tried to form something similar to Viridian Entente or Auto Verde or something. And he's been kicked out. So I think this is just them warping history a little bit because they don't like VE. Which is fair enough, but like, yeah, no. Sheepy intervened in the coup, but in the end, the upstarts were to win out. The upstarts. That's interesting wording. It was later revealed that those in the VE faction initially supported the TS treaty as a means to entangle us in a conflict we did not wish, a plot to which obviously we could not indulge in or accept. No context on what that plot is. fantastic. Um, yeah, I think that just colors their opinion of it. Yeah, so the side that tried to manipulate them is the side they don't like. Makes sense. But I would start with this and then leave that afterwards if you're going to portray it that way. Inquisition's Leviticus, the e-lawyering of a block in the CB. Okay, so this is the Civil War and all of this. This will be fun. This will be interesting. I'm going to have some hot takes here, I feel. So Inquisition's Leviticus, the e-lawyering, yeah, okay. Those rebels and the VE favored a new grouping emerging from all corners of the web, one which would create arguably the second or third strongest power base that PNW has ever seen. Or maybe, but I mean, without it, then Syndisphere reigns supreme. So, like, not great that they were forming a sphere, but I mean, they kind of needed to at that point. UPN was never going to win by itself. The tip of the sphere was undoubtedly MPO, but who joined them was what made the Inquisition such a formidable and game-changing group. Syndisphere had a very large and influential faction known as Obsidian Order, which was comprised of TKR, BK, and BOC. All three got along, but TKR's conservatism as wanting to remain number one strained relations in the bloc. Wanting to remain number one. I mean, score is score. How can you change that? Like, BK would just have to catch up naturally through growth. I think what that's really getting at is that TKR, like, they didn't want to remain number one in like rank or anything. They wanted to be number one in terms of TKR was in charge of the Obsidian Order. The conservatism in this sense is that's how some spheres used to run. Like, Syndicate was led by the Syndicate, right? It's in the name. They ran the block. But, BK wanted them to be equals. TKR was like, no, we're slightly larger, we're older, we're the Leviathan from CN. You guys are those amateurs from CN. So we should be in power. And I think that's the crux of it, that they didn't view them as equals. And so BK and BOC wanted to leave, but also I think in BK's view, they wanted to surpass TKR. Like, that was their goal. They wanted to be more than a rival. They wanted to beat them, and they couldn't think of a way of doing that while being in TKR's shadow. So the Cola, another former TS, a Star Protectorate, also got ANSI and Growing Board. They, along with CS, engaged in talks with a rising star Lordaeron, led by Caster, and those talks broke down, but they seeded enough of an idea. Caster is always trying to create a third sphere in PNW. He's an interesting character. Like, he gets away with so much more than anyone else. I think mainly because he's fun, right? Like, he wants to roll another random alliance. Well, it's Caster. He just wants to make the game interesting. Like, he wants to tear Syndisphere apart and create a third block to rival them and MPO. Well, it's Caster, I mean. And then he did the same thing with IQ later. He wants to tear IQ apart and create a third sphere. Well, it's Caster, you know. He's, in some ways, he's been a very positive force for the game in that way. So those talks broke down, but they seemed enough of an idea. Okay, Cola would merge with BOC to form Zodiac, and along with Cornerstone, were able to convince BK to step into the unknown and join MPO in forming the Inquisition. I thought it was more the other way around, but I mean, it could be either way. So, a block that pulled MPO slightly away from their old allies in Covenant due to its supremacy clause, but one that CS's side was a combination of most of the strength of the mid-tier in Orbis. Oh, that was another factor, which is being completely left out here, which is important for the BK and TKR relationship too. So, at the time, there were only two real coalitions, which is Covenant plus MPO versus Syndisphere. And while Syndisphere was always going to win the wars and be super powerful, the tiering on MPO's side was kind of brutal. And it meant that in each of the successive wars, then the mid-tier alliances, i.e. the small alliances in Syndicate, would be punished the most. And BK had more small members than TKR did. TKR was outgrowing them from memory. So BK viewed itself like BK wanted to beat TKR, right? But they were an equal to MPO, and TKR wanted to beat TS, but they were somewhere in between TS and BK. So by BK teaming up with MPO, what it meant was that there was no real opponent in the mid tier that could fight them, and that would give them it would give them the economic security to catch up with TKR, which they couldn't do if they were going to be permanently fighting MPO every 3 to 6 months to slow MPO down and prevent them growing, which is what they would need to do to actually stop MPO, because MPO's economic system was better than Syndisphere's in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's interesting. So there was a bit of pragmatism from BK. There was no accident in my eyes. The Inquisition had a similar theme, player base, and strategy as a group known as Oculus from Cybernations. That also ties into it, the idea that the CN Oculus had people that were in CN's Oculus joined PNW and then recreated it. I don't think Supercola X was, not Supercola, Supernova X was in Oculus, but I think there were claims that some of the people tied to them or that moved through them or whatever were. Indeed, elements from Oculus who were not in BK and CS were successfully joining them and working up to achieve the... Yeah, see? Exactly. So, it's an interesting argument. I haven't seen too much evidence for it, but I don't rule it out entirely. It's fascinating how many of the top alliances who led Syndisphere were predominantly populated by non-Oculus players or non-Cybernation. That's just wrong. That is so incorrect. If you're gonna say that IQ is the successor to Oculus, you must admit that, like, Syndicate is the successor to MI6 and Mushroom Kingdom, and the not Oculus wasn't given like a defined name, or I don't know the defined name, but there were like other CN blocks which 100% do have ties to Syndicate. So I don't know about that one. I'll give it to you. I'll say, like, yeah, okay, the Oculus, but then you guys have CN ties too. You guys were not majority PNW players. I don't think there were any, like, pure PNW, like, native alliances. Maybe Lordaeron. Arg, I think, was predominantly PNW natives. But, like, Orgadon and stuff had ties to, like, MPO and Supernova X and a bunch of other alliances. And Random Insanity, I think that was another one Orgadon was a part of. And I think it has ties to ARG, more broadly. But yeah, I don't know about that. It's an interesting idea, though. So this... okay, continue. So while the side active and IQ were all CN colonies tied... while the side actors and IQ were all CN colonies tied closely to Oculus or players in that web in general, this included the VE Coop leadership as well, and spoke to a cross-pollination that I would imagine most people in the game recognized and even possibly lamented. The stage was set for CN-style Cold Wars and blocks to be formed and almost mostly based around similar lines to the meta of CN at the time. There are some points there that are correct, I think, and some that are wrong. Firstly, the VE leadership was consistent across, Seeker was governed CN VE and PNW VE, which speaks to how the earlier point that VE was an upstart, that Seeker was an upstart, is wrong, right? If VE was a colony from CN, which it was, indisputably, the leader in CN and PNW would presumably be the right leader. And I think Goldie was also CN. Uh, I don't think Yoda was. Which, yeah, I mean, the the VE coup leadership, whatever. Seeker and Goldie, they were in the right there. They were from CN. They had the original alliance name. If someone created the Syndicate in DNS or Trounced or Nations of Risk, right, and it had in it Partisan and two other people you don't know, and those two other people take over and say, "Ah, no, we are the real Syndicate." They're not. It's whoever was tied to the PNW branch. It's why when Wana created MPO and PNW, um, the syndicate says, "Well, that isn't the real MPO. Don't worry, that isn't the real MPO because they didn't have approval from CNMPO. They didn't have enough people there." I don't know. Like by U.S. standards, I guess they would be. So in which case, then the founder of MPO is in TS. I know about that. It's weird. Uh, okay. He's right in this sense, though, that MPO did view the game as CN, I think, mostly. And that was in part, I think that's because just what they knew and where they were coming from. And I think it was also just part strategy. It's what worked for them at the time, and it just happened to coincide. And there was other elements here. There are like CN traditions and stuff that Syndicate pushed too. Like they were not a uniquely PNW native alliance, which is the wrong characterization of them. But Syndicate was ideologically different. They did want to change things from CN. The IQ did not, which is interesting. So at multiple points throughout early 2018, following their formation, Inquisition was believed to be targeting and plotting against multiple Synsphere allies, chiefly TKR. However, Mensa was also very much in the mix, and the bad blood between TKR and Macho IQ was a contributing factor. While Mensa merely posed a convenient target thanks to their general culture of belligerence. Yeah, that's, yep, 100%. IQ, like, from the day it founded, was 100% plotting that war. Syndicate, I would presume they were also plotting it. Like, there was a lot of tension and disputes back then. But I could also see TS trying to avoid the war for a little bit and trying to break IQ apart. TS maintained the ties to Zodiac and BK during this time. I won't say it wasn't a move to narrow down possibilities for us in the battlefield if the situation came to that, even if it would perhaps limit us, but there was not really any point during the process when TS was seen to be in the crosshairs. And in general, I'd steer this in the bit of ground. Yeah, they had no risk of losing the war at that point, and their perception, like Zodiac and BK weren't like that powerful, and they thought they could break them off. It didn't work though, unfortunately. For them. So one group caught in the new struggle was Spectrum, formed shortly before IQ was announced. The group comprised of TS ally Stark, Ragnarok, and RNR and OWR. This was a really interesting block because it was viewed as sort of a third party briefly, but they were all so small. They weren't actually able to do anything. This was especially salient considering most of them were fairly young alliances and were certainly not ready to enter world politics. I think they fought on the side of TS, or they stayed neutral. I forget, but like they were not a big power. OWR, back then and even now, it's probably the worst cowards in PNW. And it's not just me disliking OWR, which I do. It's that they pieced out of like 2 or 3 globals within like a week. Like they were famous for participating in the Blitz and then just bailing. R&R, even until very, very recently, was just sitting and farming. Or is that the original R&R? I forget. It might be actually. And in which case that R&R is just different. Ragnarok was pretty good. House Stark was pretty good even back then. Was TS actually going to hit IQ? In a word, no. We were going to participate in an offensive against the IQ Covenant sphere as a secondary combatant, but we would not be first movers. Okay, that's an interesting one. I kind of, I don't doubt that, but I feel like the mention of this is probably because of some old narrative. Like he's defending against something that's not being claimed here, or that isn't even implicitly mentioned. So my guess is that IQ alleged that TS plotted against them, and that TS here is saying they didn't, and that they were a secondary party, and that TKR and stuff were doing more of it. Which I mean I could buy. Um, yeah, TS still thinks I can split off BK and Zodiac, and I mean they might be able to do it, or they might have been able to do it, if the war didn't happen. So, in a surprise move update for Western Christians on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, many elements of the Inquisition and Covenant attacked TS. 5 alliances joined the initial salvo in one of the largest blitzes against a single opponent that the game had witnessed. It was a move that no one from our side expected or had any intel on. I dare say the target lists still had fresh ink on them when the move happened. Okay, I didn't know that. I thought it was actually fairly expected. So that is news. Get Good Friday is one of the name variants. If I remember correctly, EMC or Syndicate wanted Get Good Friday, and I think BK did as well. But the wiki people named it Trail of Tears, which was sort of a diss at MPO. Like the Get Good Friday is saying that like people didn't perform well, or it's just a spin on words. But Trail of Tears is the idea that like the tiering strategy of IQ failed, which it kind of did, but the strategy itself wasn't flawed, as we've seen, because every big alliance nowadays uses tiering. Like it is the word in like PW politics now. So yeah, that the wiki people were wrong on that count. Yeah, it's interesting they were surprised. The spoiler alert that is that no alliance in PW history that I can recall has ever emerged on top after the broadside that TS took at the opening of Get Good Friday. That is incorrect now. That was true at the time, but it changed in 2019 and 20. I think if there's been any other big ones. I think 2019 is the big one. Yeah, I think BK later fought more alliances than TS did. But this was a very impressive event at the time. Yeah, as the largest blitzes against a single opponent the game had witnessed, it was a move that no one from outside or had expected or had any intel on. I dare say the target lists still had fresh ink on them when the move happened. Oh, and also TKR. That's who they missed here. TKR and Nightfall was attacked by way more alliances than that, like 10 or 20. Yeah. So this going on. Yeah, their intention was that TS probably had the most skill and flexibility, and they wanted to remove them from the fight immediately. Yep. I mean, it was probably true. They'd been on top for a long time. They recruited a lot of active and skilled people. The CB effectively boiled down to intelligence leaked from Spectrum. The prime piece of the puzzle was a set of logs never shared by IQ for some odd reason, where Alexio from Ragnarok was cornered by Bezos from Zodiac and divulged that TS would be going to war soon. My suspicion was that OWR had acted in bad faith with Spectrum and shared intelligence and shared the intel with BK, who passed it on to Zodiac or a coalition channel writ large, which then Bezos opportunistically took advantage of. IQ trumped up some ground logs of master plans of an impending hit on them, but they failed to ever show the evidence, and quite frankly, they were incorrect in their assumptions. So I actually never knew like what those logs were or where they came from, but I do remember the arguments around them vaguely, especially by people discussing them after the fact. And I think the idea was that I think the logs that they had, it wasn't just one thing. It was more than one thing. So that's why he mentions twice, where it could be Alexia or it could also be OWR. I think they had multiple, and they didn't, like, they were trying to sow confusion by not revealing how much they knew. Because if you know how much the opponent has, you can lie. And Syndicate and lots of other top alliances do in that position. So by concealing how much they knew, but obviously knowing much more than they should know, then IQ sort of prevented some of that. And then another element to it was that they didn't want to leak for normative reasons, which is that you don't leak diplomatic conversations or whatever. And that they could use this in future, presumably, to condemn opponents leaking on them. And I don't know, I've always found them kind of weak arguments because of how important the war was, and so I kind of agree with what's his name? Zed here. They should have just shared them. To my understanding, they were just very specific on, like, this is a plot and this is something we gotta do. And that would have helped that case a lot. As for master plans to hit them, I mean, most of Cindersphere wanted them rolled. I mean, IQ didn't need logs of a war being planned against them. This would never happen nowadays. People would never wait for logs like this nowadays. They would just hit on the presumption, or the tension, or the expectation. This is such an archaic thing. Let's read some comments. To be honest, people... yeah, no, you're right. 100%. The top of PNW is pretty much the only people that... The top level leaders of PNW in FA and in IA to some extent are the only people that get known. It's rough. I guess you can also sort of become known if you just talk a lot in a lot of the popular news servers, or if you talk on the forums, because the forums are only used by leaders and the game's diplomats. So if you talk on the forums, then people will know you, even if you're an average member. And if you're trying to climb up the ranks FA-wise, one of the best pieces of advice is, yeah, talk on the forums. Not excessively and not with huge word walls, but you just talk there every once in a while, and then people like become familiar with you. I would presume it's equivalent to writing in a newspaper or something, right? That people would learn your name that way. I wouldn't make threads though. You don't make threads until you're already known. But replying to threads is a good way to start getting known. I don't know if we can ever sort of change that and like get more people involved. It's challenging. I think that one of the limitations is that the game is so fast. And I've said this to Alex half a dozen times and to developers and stuff. If they just slowed down war, right? Like, instead of destroying 200 planes, you destroy 100 planes per airstrike. You double the time it takes, or the time that alliances can have to respond, right? So, well, you don't even have to change the damage, or you can double the damage. The damage is the same, but you just want to, like an infrastructure, you just want to give alliances more time to respond, because members have they're incapable of providing input right now, because every alliance is operating like some sort of first responder rapid response unit, and not like how a country would. For example, if the UK was invaded by, or France was invaded by Germany, right? Of course, the military would leap to the forefront, right? But nearby Belgium might go, well, we're going to decide if we're going to enter. Right? We'll hold a vote, we'll go through a process or whatever. And in PNW, that would be like if Syndicate hit UPN, right? Well, then Gato could hold a vote and decide who was coming in, and it would need like a day to do that. But because of how fast war is, because it's literally determined in the first 36 hours, and even in the first 6 hours, you can sort of tell how it's going. Gato cannot consult its members. There is no universe they can consult their members. And militarization is so fast that, and like people are always a max military in some regard, that like you can't even vote on militarizing or vote on war. If the game was just a little bit slower, you could actually vote on war, or you could vote on response. Actually, even then, though, the issue with it is even if you make those adjustments to the game now, so the game can operate in that way, it won't, because after a decade and a half, the nations and community has become accustomed to giving their members zero power, zero influence. Yeah, I've said I've said that in the past that getting blitzed means you lose, and generally it's true, because the people that are blitzing typically have like way more numbers or power, and blitz advantage is like a 33% buff. In terms of like if you consider like the military advantages of airstriking first or ground attacking first or whatever, and the military advantages of having that slight militarization increase on your opponent, and then also probably having more numbers, it's like a 33% buff, if not more. Blitz advantage is insane, but occasionally you have preemptive wars, where people blitz first because they know they're gonna be attacked, in which case it's not guaranteed. I once said this. Members are like provinces. In in those games, paradox games, right? Then in like Civilization, you'll have cities. Like each city is a member. And in something like Victoria 3 or 2 or EU4 or whatever, they're literally provinces. They're a region in your country. And some regions are richer than others, and some you can recruit more troops. Um, that is basically it, because they just have to follow commands. And occasionally they'll rebel or you'll lose one, but it's not a big deal. That's how they view them. It's very disappointing. None of the alliances in PNW are considered in any way representative, except for like maybe Gato, but that's a very brief thing because Gato's trying to change that. And they need to. I mean, it's inarguable that they need to. They won't function and survive as they are. Yeah, not even Holy Roman Empire, just a province. Blocks are similar though. Blocks would be like the HRE, where you have one party which rules as like the king or the emperor, and then you have a bunch of smaller parties within the country, or smaller states within the country, principalities, that swear fealty to them, but also kind of act up every once in a while and have disputes with other princes. But anyway, where am I going? Let's have a look at this. So I found out that during most of the build-up to the war, BK and Zodiac had effectively gone dark on their allies, while only we were sharing information back and forth with ours, as ROK, Ragnarok, had the dual tie between the two. They were the weak link. However, OWR wasn't very friendly towards TS, and I don't think they would have cared if we were hit. That's interesting. OWR, ever a wily character. So the funny thing was that we explicitly told House Stark and Ragnarok that we'd never make them choose a side here, and we would only use them to protect us from non-combatants like Arg. Okay, so did they fight? I don't know. I guess it will appear later. Lordaeron negotiations, one of the most interesting side shows of the war, led by Caster, a fairly talented IA manager, but an absolutely toxic FA personality. Wow, that's rude.
Lordaeron had tried for months to get a treaty with someone from the easy mode coalition Syndicate. I mostly tried to keep him somewhat appeased, but I knew that there would be absolutely zero chance the rest of our gov would sign off on treatying them. They were successful in getting ties to IQ, but were not invited, not central players in that block, in the same way the Cola and CS became. Yeah, no one trusted Caster back then, which makes sense. I mean, it's Caster. Lordaeron asked us for a peace around the same time of the second round of combat. They cited a good individual performance and looking to just exit the war. The performance had been inflated by the fact that they were such a low priority to counter that we didn't bother as hard, and being a mostly unorganized rabble with some questionable internals. I mostly just said nah. There was some back and forth, and right around the time I believed I was ready to let them go with a white peace, they stormed off in a huff and didn't bargain individually again for the rest of the war. That is interesting. He's being quite harsh. He's being quite harsh to Lordaeron. My voice is dying again. Long streams. Lots of talking. Another alliance who approached us for an individual peace were United Purple Nations, half-heartedly entering at the wheel of Acadia and MPO. Context on this, because it's interesting. After the previous war, not Trail of Tears, then maybe it was. I forget. Anyway, UPN at this point was extremely weak. There might have even been a Rose Protectorate at this time. But yeah, Pacifica selling them on the premise of 1 or 2 rounds at most, and they could exit in a quick victory. UPN got far more than they bargained for in our conflict. It was kind of sad that UPN and Acadia were yet again our foes in combat. It wasn't sad at all. They relished rolling UPN. From everything I've heard from both TS and UPN, that is a serious grudge. Because we had held up so well, and we were able to mostly trash many of the UPN nations who were in relatively poor fighting shape. In fact, they had no idea that they would even be fighting, or who they would be fighting, until about a day before the conflict at most, because IQ didn't trust them. No one trusted them, even Acadia. So they did relatively poorly in combat, and simply they wanted out. Their hang-up was that I was unwilling to relent on a guarantee that we would not severely punish Acadia, and that they did not want to change the abbreviation of their block name from Covenant to something that they did not have the... Okay, so the term of the peace... Yeah, okay. I mean, I agree with UPN on that one. I didn't know about that. So Sindisphere, the coalition, which eventually merged into Syndicate, they were pushing to rename Covenant. Like, Covenant was the oldest block in the game at that point. I think it still might be like the oldest block in Nation Sim history or something. It's disbanded now, but it was the oldest block in Nation Sim history. It's that's really rough. Yeah, UPN actually did kind of good here. They were trying to save their ally, partly out of self-interest because no one else would really work with them except for Acadia. And there was a really long relationship, so they wanted to protect Acadia, and yeah, they didn't want to change their name. That's reasonable. I would have let them out. But yeah, anyway, the clusterfuck of a damn it. They made me swear. The cluster of a coalition negotiation was probably one of my biggest personal failures of the conflict. I see Lordship and Kaiser, Infinite Citadel. He's the Mushroom Kingdom person, I think. Lordship and Kaiser, they were from TKR, were fairly proactive in jumping in on our side to handle a lot of the negotiations, which I figured was a fine thing anyway. I tactically did not want to begin coalition talks until it was clear that we would either stabilize or drown, and in the event of the latter, I wasn't really keen on showing it without some backing. I did run the risk of having the rest of us here sacrificing us on an altar, and then washing their hands of the matter. That's interesting. That would only really happen if Syndicate was responsible for plotting the war, which they claim they weren't. And it would also only happen if IQ didn't care at all about about who started it. Which I guess that's equally, if not more likely, true. The grand peace channels were an absolute fest of memes and terrible banter. At multiple points, the talks simply broke down due to the extremely unproductive exchanges of no you and bad behavior. I really refused to speak or participate in something so fruitless, and admittedly, I feel bad that I did not try and make an effort to do so. Elitism, that is not a small component. Towards the end of the war, it was clear that MPO, at the very least, was replicating our ground zero strategy against us. In general, we did well among nations at a certain point. Below tier nations and nations more unfortunate in combat were pulled down into a very deep pit of opposition with little way out. In essence, the meat grinder. The ending piece was very long and brutally done, but in the end, Inquisition and Covenant simply ran out of steam. I think that's because IQ dragged it out or something, if I remember correctly. Or the war wasn't totally over, like they still held the lower tier or something. Summon fire, yeah, okay. Well, if they pushed harder reps, that would have ended very badly. Like, the game was still very much on a knife's edge at that point. Even if IQ lost and they were punished brutally, there's a chance that, like, more people from Cindersphere would split off and side with IQ. Paper list, please. The war concluded and TS was faced with a difficult decision on what path to take. The economic damage was quite high, but TS came out with a positive ratio. That doesn't matter. If the economic damage is high, that's not good for them. We did not immediately drop either BK or Zodiac. Yeah, we retained the Zodiac Treaty for reasons of realpolitik, and for the off chance that they would be persuaded to drop out of IQ and rejoin us. That's what I said earlier. Jess and I had been working hard on trying to get the old Cola segments favorable and active to support us again, and that tie was kept for such an express purpose. This is interesting. So the Sentinel group, one of the many migrant communities to TS was from CN Sparta, a group who mostly tend to play together across games and who have been discussed previously here. That's what they mean by Spartans. Okay, that's interesting. So while the founding members of TS may have had some ties towards the CN Alliance MI6, the later mid-level gov and high-ranking associates during this time became increasingly people tied to CN Sparta. Some of them had frustrations about the direction RFA was taking, and they also wanted to do more mass recruitment, which wasn't really a thing. They, under the cover of an alliance-hopping plan, I think, started to consider what they would need to form a splinter alliance and go out into the world on their own. I even floated the idea to Chance privately that if this actually went through, we might have to disband the alliance and send people on to different corners of the world. Wow. Okay, interesting. It eventually came out to me that Jess had grave concerns that Chance and I would be quite hostile to accepting new nations and playing for a broader playstyle. So this is the clash between the elitism and, I guess, trying to be a mass member alliance to compete with MPO and the others. Had they gone ahead with it, I don't know if I would have remained in TS. I would have probably either joined an alliance I had personal or familiar ties with. TKR, MPO, TC, Mentor, HS. So that is just wild. So he would have left TS as it tried to become more like MPO and BK and joined MPO. That is so confusing. I do not understand this person at all. I don't recall if Jess and I had ever settled this formally, but my presumption is that Chance did some voodoo magic and talked her into staying on. We were probably fairly close to such a split happening, and whatever witchcraft Chance... Okay, yeah. He saved TS. Interesting. I think Jess had frustrations that she wanted to get out regarding the mechanics of the game, and I think she also realized that we as an alliance could really be and do so much more. The idea for us to go paperless, shed some of the baggage, and try a bunch of new things out emerged. This is always an interesting aspect of the game, that there are always like pirates or paperless people that have bold ideas on how to fix big alliances or change the game. And sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're just really wrong. And they just sabotage groups. And this is true for mid-range alliances and top-range alliances. There are really famous instances of it where you have leaders that have never been pirates that think piracy is cool because ARG makes it look cool. And ARG likes to pat people on the back when they do well. And they don't get enough of that in their own alliance. So they'll sabotage big alliances to become pirates. And then after like 3 weeks of getting rolled and not making any money at City 30, they give up. And like their legacy is just ashes. Yeah. Which I don't think that would have been the case here. I think TS would have actually improved a lot if they'd become a mass member alliance. They would be something like Rose now. Yeah. She was ahead of her time, I think, on that point. So it may be common knowledge, or maybe it wasn't, but paperless as an idea in TS was not new when we did it a year prior, spearheaded by Partisan. TS considered paperless was a decision we should take. At the time, TS was caught between taking off and being an elite-only alliance with perhaps little new blood or ideas to freshen up a stale environment, or having an influx of new and low-tier nations. Okay. Paperless at the time was only going to really work if we didn't allow new players in, or at least so we thought. Well, yeah, if they went paperless and they had a bunch of new people, then they'd just get raided. Terminus Est, Rosway, or ARG were the leaders of that group of players. The idea at the time probably died because Partisan, Justin, and Roya each disappeared from the debate to attend a real life. Okay, that's interesting. They considered it once before. I don't know the logic of that, though. I don't know why they would do that. Maybe because they thought that they'd already won, hence they were just riding off into the sunset. Paperless again reared its head, albeit with a slightly different cast of characters at the top of the executive. I had 3 things that needed to be addressed if we were to do it. That we could economically and militarily survive if we were caught out alone. I mean, barely, but sure. They were at their height, but like the rest of the game was pretty strong. That we could build a Diplo Corps and get a small team for relations building, and that we could do right by the standards of most of our current allies. We did not have other treaty ties at the time. I rolled Charming Friends and looted them, like a lot of other people. And then Teutonic Order was also paperless and got looted and rolled. And Coalition had the same thing happen to them before they joined TS. So Jessica promised over her dead body that the former were not just possible, but it was most probable and likely. She was wrong on that count. The latter was also pretty easy since TC and CF were simply willing to roll with us and get rolled out of the game as a consequence. But the middle one, well, that was going to require some work on my end, and it was going to be a grand experiment that we weren't familiar with. I mean, you had some pretty known people from TS, kinda. Not really, I don't know, I wasn't really active at that time, FA-wise. What did our allies make of it? Well, I think there was mostly skepticism at first, yeah, because they were abdicating responsibility and passing the crown to TKR, which turned into shock when we actually went through with it. I don't think most of them figured we would go ahead with it, mostly because we're simply way too risky with the risks. But the risk wasn't just for us. TKR had long enjoyed their ability to maintain a status quo thanks to the diplomatic lever we provided. And Mensa had long benefited from having us as a shield to prevent someone from popping off at them for their belligerent nature. Mensa disbanded not long after this. Others, like Pantheon, more economic social club than Serious Alliance, needed someone to act on their behalf in the wider world, while those in Spectrum were now cut adrift from the one external tie that truly respected and nourished them. Yeah. In the end, we bid our farewells while there was definitely some under-the-table, not totally secret collaborations. I do think that was more hyped up than it should be. Much of that was a check to outside parties, IQ and Paperless, to ensure that they did not jump someone in the medium term following the split and was purely defensive. For some reason, private bankers decided to lend billions of dollars to IQ to help them rebuild, and although in some fairness we did hoard their loans initially thanks to some clever accounting, it took some time for this to happen. Nonetheless, there was certainly a need to ensure that we would not be broadsided again in the same manner, and some low-key placeholder defensive agreements were essentially the answer. Those loans, they have to be like one of the biggest mysteries in PNW. because I think it's like 40 billion or something was loaned to IQ at the end, and prior to that, it was like tens of billions. Without those loans, NPO would never have become a threat. Just never in a million years, it would have become a threat. And it wasn't just Seb. Like, there were a number of people loaning to them. And most of the people that were loaning to them were their opponents. Even Syndicate later loaned to them. I think they gave them like 20 billion. It's ludicrous. That secret treaty, though, did so much damage. So much damage. If Syndicate had split off, and it had been a real split, and either there had been a war between Syndicate and TKR, or IQ and Syndicate, or whatever, if Syndicate had taken an L after walking away, or if... Yeah, actually, I think that, yeah, if they'd taken an L after walking away, and they truly created a new independent third sphere, I think the two, like IQ and EMC, would have broken up a bit. But because there was that secret tie, like, neither side wanted to move. And everyone could sense that there was something there. And it was later proven with Church of Spaceology wanting to hit TS, and TKR saying they would come in to defend them. And Church of Spaceology versus TS would have been a great war too, in the sense that Church of Spaceology was former TS people. So it would have been a TS civil war. And TS would have won it, I think. And yeah, so it's just foolish. Or just a mistake, I think. In the end, we bid our farewells. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. So the Great Stagnation, or why no one did anything for nearly a year. Oh, this was also actually context. TS had never lost a war at that point, so that also factored in. Like, we can't entirely blame them. These were people that did not know what would happen if they lost a war. Like, they didn't know if they'd lose a ton of people, or if no one would leave, or what would happen. A lot of the alliances they defeated in the past, like UPN, fell from grace in spectacular fashion. The Great Stagnation, or why no one did anything for nearly a year. No one in the game did anything for a year. Not just TS, but TS was especially obvious because they were by themselves. Many people had commented of late that TS twiddled its thumbs for many moons during most of my tenure. In our paperless phase, that is technically correct, but it misses the point and lacks the context needed to make an accurate assessment of what it was we were doing. I'd argue that while we could have certainly stood to have been more active in world affairs, we were also afforded a luxury to slip into a cocoon and try to look out of the limelight, i.e. they wanted to outgrow everyone. The various third spheres and unaligned parties were quite interested in what we would be doing. KT and Teutonic at the beginnings of a sphere, until KT sabotaged, looted, and destroyed Teutonic, along with a bunch of raiders, myself included, and had many feelers out in terms of trying to establish a third side. Rose had begun to drift away from the rest of Easy Mode, and in doing so formed their own smaller side group. If I remember correctly with KT, they wanted to be a major power. That was a factor in wanting to split off. But two, they promised to defend, or they promised to fight with IQ against the Commonwealth. And then they backed out at the last minute during Trail of Tears. And I don't think they could have tipped the war, but they could have had a substantial effect. So, KT at that point had no strong allies. They were third sphere not by choice. And they'd also sabotaged their Pantheon relationship by telling pirates the nuke Pantheon. Almost as a joke, but yeah. Rose had begun to drift away from the rest of Easy Mode, and in doing so were forming their own smaller side group. Rose was they were silently trying to improve their position. They were just trying to stay on the winning side. Even though Syndicate and TKR were weaker now, or somewhat separate, I think Rose still deferred to both of them. And Rose even took a proactive stance in trying to combat IQ at one point. There was always the possibility of rounding up several of the super tier groups and trying to join a big whale block, and most of the paperless seemed relatively amiable to what we might be trying to accomplish. Even in when they're trying to be chill, TS tries to create a supergroup. We disbanded the greatest hegemony in the game to form a giant whale hegemony. Of course. So you were probably wondering if we ever contacted Inquisition at any point during this. The short answer is that for most of 2017, following GGF, when we were paperless, we did not. I was skeptical that they'd actually want to do something different besides sit on their current treaties. I suspect the feeling was mutual. I think there were attempts to break them up, but yeah, it was mostly from TKR and Rose. There was too much bad blood or disagreement between them and TS. From my perspective, joining up with IQ would have been an unpalatable move in terms of both trashing most of our former allies, but also a poor choice from a strategic military standpoint. There was a point where Jess and I did try to pull Zodiac back out of IQ through Ares, who's Zodiac. When we got wind of their gov being inactive and fractured, it did not work out, mostly because our contacts were fairly inactive. Eventually, Zodiac's internals failed and most of them would roll into BK, which was probably a natural home for them. It was not. No, they did not settle well into BK. The BK thing was really interesting because there are a bunch of like fantastic interviews with Tibber and Kuru and Leo, which really contextualize how that dispute happened, or how that split happened, because BK and TS were like so close. And even quite recently in the new version of BK or whatever, BK 3.0, they're still very close. But I think the dispute, it was a weird dispute. Like, I think most of the tension was with TKR, and TS just didn't want to sacrifice the TKR relationship over trying to rebuild the BK one. It is true that we kept some close ties to certain alliances. Okay, neither could have tried to be actively involved in the game. CF kind of joined TS. Coalition 100% joined TS. All of them did. But CF, I mean, most of them went inactive and just quit. How Stark, yeah, they were always loyal to TS. There was jokes like that TS, or the House Stark, sorry, was like the god dog of TS. And it's only until very recently that those jokes weren't popular. Church of Spaceology, Manny's project, and Hogwarts Partisan's project were both paperless and kept in high-level discussions. Okay, I'm just going to skip through this because I think there's a lot of just we did well stuff. Exploring the possibility of doing something, there's only one of it. But TKL wanted to create a third sphere or try and pull MPO off to create to break up EMC and also, just try and break things up. Try and break up IQ. Because IQ seemed like a permanent fixture of the game if it wasn't broken up. Whereas if TKR could peel MPO away, temporarily break up IQ, and then cancel MPO later, then like the game would restore to balance and TKR would be in a way better position than if IQ became this permanent fixture of the game. Yeah, TKR was too large, number one. They didn't have enough useful pseudo-allies in paperless, and they had a lot more bad blood. There's the crux of it. I have commented on PNW becoming a colony clone of CN earlier in this work. I think the analysis still remains mostly true. CN, after a period of openness and exploration, came to be dominated by either a hegemony or a pair of rival powers in a Cold War standoff. It was only after assurances of success were gained that wars could happen. The paperless era of TS was in many ways an attempt to break that cycle, which was going to continue for quite some time had an intervention not occurred. Many of you will probably point to an irony or hypocrisy in terms of how I frame some of my arguments or say I would do things. The issue with the Syndicate split, I think, is that he's right in that it was attempting to create a third party, but by just staying paperless and not splitting EMC, he didn't really create a third party. He didn't really give the big alliances reason to split off. TKR, their strategy was way more compelling than TS's. Like, TKR's strategy had a chance of working. I don't think TS's ever had a chance of working. And the ideological narratives around TS going paperless were also way more like self-interested versus TKR's, which even when TKR sold their Kool-Aid, it was, we're going to make the game dynamic and make everything more, I don't think it was individualistic, but it was like more RP focused and stuff, more roleplay focused. We don't just want realpolitik. I think that was some of it. There was a great thread, which I think they've somewhat mostly denounced now as like all politics not good anymore. But it was compelling at the time, even amongst IQ people. So yeah, and then there was 9 months of peace after TS split. So, I mean, if TS had stayed, like, it wouldn't have improved the game. But it's just how TS left was probably like the least optimal way to do it. And from what I can tell, it wasn't entirely their choice. It was in part internal disputes. The meta of the game really was driven around the Cold War that existed between IQ and the now TKR-led Easy Mode Coalition. By exiting, we gave ourselves a chance to break out of that and do something different, i.e. do nothing, but at the same time, the problem of all the turtles doomed most meaningful action. There was simply no way to gather enough support to actually do anything productive. This is an interesting idea, actually. So MPO people, they came from Oculus, from MPO, from Umbrella, from that sort of camp. TKR has these ties to Mushroom Kingdom. The Guardian people have ties to MI6 and to Sin Alliances, but there's a lot of CN people on TKR's side that, they were from that opposition to MPO. Which, if you think about it, TS was probably one of the only, like, not true ideologues, but they were probably one of the only groups that didn't want the game to be like CN. Like, they wanted it to be a different thing, still similar to CN, but different. IQ wanted it more like CN. TKR wanted it more like CN in a lot of ways. They just wanted to win, which they didn't do in CN. So, I think TS actually kind of just hurt this. Like, they put the game in the hands of the CN people. And then they complain that the CN people didn't do anything but CN. Although I would also just argue more broadly that it isn't just TKR, it isn't just MPO, it isn't just IQ or EMC that are filled with CN colonies or alliances. The entire upper echelon of the game is dominated by CN people. It still is, because the CN people are the ones with connections, and they never want to leave their roles for whatever reason. They're the boomers of PNW. They have all the wealth and power, and regardless of like what you think of their talents or anything else, it's just that they have these networks that are very hard to compete against as newer groups. Like, there's no reason why you would hire someone that doesn't know anything, or that doesn't have the network but knows a lot, versus someone that has a network and knows a lot. You just pick the better option. And so that's what happens with a lot of FA and leadership. Like, it is hard to get into those roles, even if the game isn't that complicated. If TS had switched out, like, if they switch out Partisan, who's been around for like 15 years, knows everyone, knows all these histories, for someone that's only been around for 2 years, like, half of your relationships with other alliances just vanish. Because you don't have the history. Or you don't know how to talk to them. Yeah, the whole game felt stuck, and they couldn't change anything. Unlucky. An internal snapshot: on the economic side of the house, we continued to cook up grand plans. We considered an alliance hopping alliance to work as a tax farm, treasure hunting scheme, and a recruitment tool. Okay, so it was a tax farm. That is such a meme. I have heard the amount of alliances that TS calls tax farms is comical. And this they just admit that ES was a tax farm. Wow. That is so interesting. That is fascinating. I'm going to use that in an argument in the future. Yep. 100%. Next time they call us a tax farm, I will just call them one, like, right back. Because apparently they are. Whoever shared this is going to be questioning that decision right now. So we had looked at we looked at during doing contract work for other alliances as well. Okay, that's cool. We tried to think of doing that as well. We thought of doing that as well, but it didn't quite work out because the people don't want to pay you what you're worth. We'd serve as Ghostbusters or raid defenders or advisors. We didn't think of advisors. That's kind of a cool idea. We never really worked out the pricing details or anything formal in the plan. It was another example of the off-the-wall ideas that we tried to cook up to fill the time and have a more vibrant and participatory alliance. Having come from a democracy in CN, I at times lamented how autocracies could stifle members in ways that democracies would not. He's right. That's a good idea, though, for engaging membership and trying to actually promote game health overall. I'm kind of disappointed they didn't do that. That would have helped the game a lot. So the anti-raid and treasure hunting team, now led by Hillbilly, was probably one of the brightest spots in the alliance. I haven't talked much about that group yet, but in its modern incarnation, treasures are just traded now, so it doesn't matter. Yakuza is irrelevant now. They were relevant when this was made, probably, but they're not now. We also had a major transition in the leadership. Roy left TS as an advisor and forum admin. Oh, that's probably why the forums are gone. Her decision was for OC reasons and largely without warning. There was a great void left by her. Sabriel deleted as well. And there was a brain drain. Yep, so as soon as the active participation in PNW ended, then yeah, they died. We talked about doing conversation and kicked. I probably didn't give enough direction to the associates who were tasked with doing conversation and chaotic diplomacy. A CN ODN meme. Okay, interesting. I think that what that means is hello, goodbye, good morning. That like the embassies were I'm losing my train of thought because it's been a while and I haven't had anything to eat. Yeah, I believe that means is that the embassies would just dull passive conversation because they couldn't actually discuss anything of substance, because anything of substance would get them rolled, which is still a problem today. Alliances like Rose, for example, like you can talk to the random 1 or 2 gov that they send, and they're nice people, and you can probably solve a raid dispute. But there's nothing of substance that's going to happen there. Like no real FA. Real FA happens at like the leadership level, or like the FA person or the shadow gov FA person, or a very old member. It doesn't happen with those embassies. Nothing gets said in embassies anymore either. Most of it happens in DMs. And even then, a lot of it happens through voice chat because DMs can be screenshotted and used for wars later, whereas recording conversations is much more taboo. Not that it doesn't happen, it's just not as common. It hasn't been used in any big globals yet. Okay, interesting. So his strategy didn't work out. He never found a good deputy for FA. That's not uncommon. FA is kind of difficult to find people for. Due to various out-of-character issues as well as growing interest in the game, he abdicated his position. He received a passing grade for head of TSFA. Hmm. I don't know how to judge because like I haven't seen enough of the previous iterations. I know a lot of Artisan's work tangentially and from reading history and stuff. And in comparison to him, you didn't do so well. But you're also, I guess, comparing yourself against Tartarus and the modern TS people. I haven't encountered Tartarus that much either, but he strikes me as much more new. Hmm. Okay, point of comparison. Tartarus, as much as like I don't know what to think of his reign yet, and Partisan, despite like the highs and the lows, I think Chauncey dealt with more existential crises per week than either of them. With like inheriting sort of Sabriel's collapse of an FA department or mess of an FA department, the civil war in Syndicate, Trail of Tears, which would have been a huge shock in and of itself because they almost lost, and like, there was a potential to lose there, and like yeah, they got attacked by 8 alliances, and then also going paperless and almost having a splinter in what's it called, Sparta. Like even if he wasn't responsible for those things, which he probably slightly was, he also survived them. Which, if you replace him with other TS leaders, Partisan probably could have survived it. Tartarus, maybe not. Sabriel, maybe not. Maybe these other people wouldn't have done so well. Maybe Adam wouldn't have done so well in that position. So yeah, passing grade, my friend. Fair enough. We had not been declared upon. You had been in Trail of Tears. We said at least neutral with most alliances. Oh, this is after paperless. We've not been declared upon. We said at least neutral with most alliances, and we had several possible paths for how we would pursue relations and game dynamics when they would begin to open up again. No, in terms of what TS was capable or known for, it was not the world-shaking success that people came to expect of us, and in that light, my tenure could be seen as a failure. But perhaps some things just take time to marinate, and TS might have needed such a thing. The dead should not rule the living, and to that end, I mostly disappeared. Okay. Yep, well done. On that front, well done. He retired and actually did reasonably well. While I was leaving, Nuke Blanc was plotting against them. Okay. I didn't know they had they didn't know they were a factor in the Salt War, but that's interesting. IQKT will happen concurrently to give the world some fairly all-around action. If TKR hit Nuke Block because of plans against TS, that's kind of not helping their case that they were independent. That's probably a mistake. I mean, TS could probably have handled Nuke Block by itself. I mostly cut an absent figure earlier, okay. When Partisan was coming back to TS, I was a bit skeptical, but I figured that such a thing was probably a decent move for the health of the Alliance to be politically active and evolved again. Okay. Yeah, ideas, baggage, enemies, and connections. Yeah, that's about right. It was a return to form. The epilogue. Okay, so this is actually like what happened at the end there. I assume this is 2018. He's writing this in September of 2018. This is pre-Nightfall. So on a personal level, it hurts me to fight against... Oh, this is right in like Nightfall in early days. It hurts me to fight against TKR, because TKR was, for most of the time in TS, the alliance I would have gone to if I kept playing the game, but left our holes. It's true that they had most of the CN top and MK, which is, aside from doing something with Vanguard or MPO, CN Umbrella, where I would have round up if I came over from somewhere other than Partisan. I remember TKR growing up to be a massive player, and I had figured that one day they would rule the front of the game in a fairly benevolent manner. Yes, they were the Leviathan behind TS in Syndisphere. Like MI6 was powerful in CN, but I don't think they were anything close to MK or Top. TKR had an internal crisis of sorts once IC and Lordship left. Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know much about IC. I don't think he ever really fully left, but there was sort of a change of the guard. Lordship, I think, is even still around even a little bit, but he's not the face of the Alliance anymore, and that a lot of relations changed when that happened. The dynamic vision of people like Helms, I think he means Kaiser there. This is a very interesting document because it's from before TS, before Kaiser joined TS, back when TS thought Kaiser was really cool for promoting this dynamic ideology, and before TKR had fully abandoned Helms Kaiser as well. He's now regarded in that circle as being like the worst of traitors, and his idea being a grand plot by IQ to ruin the game. I think I don't know what, actually I don't really know what to think because I don't have all the information on him. But from what I saw publicly as sort of an observer, I think he was an idealist, and he tried to live out his ideals in TKR and break up the game and make mini spheres and stuff, and they didn't want to do it. And then he joined TS and tried to do it again, but it just led into the Great War of 2019. And they just blamed him. I don't know what to make of him, but it's very interesting that he's being flattered in this document. We gradually began to drift from each other, but I think the bulk of that occurred after I left the C-suite. It's human leadership. Ultimately, their style was very status quo and conservative, hedging against multiple things. Perhaps they were too conservative, but this war will tell whether they were successful or not. They united all the whales in the game and tried to chill, and then they tried to play the sides off each other. They wanted to work with Syndicate against MPO, or MPO against Syndicate, and whoever agreed first is the side they would go with. They were literally just trying to protect themselves. So I don't know about conservative on that one. If they were playing conservatively, they would have just sided with TS against IQ, but they didn't. The meta of Orbis to this war is still mostly what it was around Get Good Friday. One group of alliances using the mechanics to cluster together and form a hyper-tier around, surrounded by the odd extra to give them political clout. And one group of alliances hoping to whale out of reach of them. A few scattered malcontents and bystanders, and then some third sphere types probing in the shadows to see what is possible, change things up. The first two of these dominate, however, and in some sense this war is very much a continuation of the conflict. If PNW is to be a different game in the months to come, this is probably a war that had to happen. Whether it is successful, only time will tell. I think it was successful, and it did change the game a lot. Because without Nightfall, I don't think you would have seen the break in TS-TKR relations that was required to make things somewhat interesting for the next few years. So in a way, the possible aftermath of this war in the grand meta reminds me of a final note, which is fitting with some, okay. Interesting. I think that quote is being misused here because from everything he's saying he did, I don't think he was working for a promised land. He was not an idealist in the sense that like Kaiser was. He might have been more idealistic than MPO or TKR, but I think he's trying to recharacterize his reign there, and it doesn't actually it doesn't make sense in the context of everything that was said. Let's read comments. I know, right? It was, but I think it was interesting. Holy shit, it was 2.5 hours. Mother of God, why? That is ridiculous. I covered the wiki in 30 minutes. Well, the watch time on this will be entertaining at the very least. And that's why my voice gave out a couple of times. Okay, well, yeah, let's answer some questions. Okay, so there's stuff about green. They're one of the only alliances to have their members with high infra, so I like them a lot. Yeah, they are. Yep, no, they are one of the only few alliances that build really high. Higher than perhaps they should. I think it's because they don't have a lot of central planning. I think the members just sort of build what they have the money for. And they don't really consider ROI. Whereas something like Singularity, they know exactly how long they have in peacetime before next war, so they know exactly what infra to buy to and what ROI to get. Because you can build a 2k infra and make more than someone that's on 3k infra because you ROI, you get a return on investment quicker. So you make the money to rebuild the infra, and then you also make a bunch of money that you can spend on cities. Whereas if you build a 3k, then you have to make more money to pay for the 3k infra rebuild, and then also to get more cities. Yeah, non-Discord's almost impossible. TFP is the only good option there. Or was the only good option there. And maybe Castle Camelot. To be honest, the only people I think recognize, yeah. I have no idea how global wars work, but from what I've heard, if you get blitzed, yeah. Members are basically stat pages. Pirating. Short-term, yeah, pirating is very short-term gain. It's faster to grow with piracy in the first 6 months, I would say. But as soon as you make enough money to get like City 25, farming is just way more profitable now. Yeah, it's quite unfortunate. I think there needs to be some pretty big buffs to loot in general. I think there's a lot of indirect nerfs by like cutting down the number of inactive nations in the game. They were just sitting there and being farmed. And also the, what's it called? Like the amount of resources they give is just totally meaningless. There's so many high tax alliances too that they just make raiding just not profitable. I would, if I could, to fix raiding and also to fix a bunch of other problems, I would cap alliance banks based on city count. So or like scaling city count. So like TS has like 4k cities or whatever, so they can have 100 million per or 10 million per city or whatever. And so that caps it to like 40 billion or whatever, 400. It gives them an upper limit on how much stuff they can have in their bank, and then also prevents the one-man alliances from having an entire alliance bank on them. And then once you have that bank in the alliance, then you allow raiders to loot. It allows them to loot members, right? And you reduce the amount of loot they get from the bank to like 0.01% or something. And then the raiders make way more money as the alliances get richer. And you would also increase the base loot on nations. So you could loot like 20% of their on-hand resources or something instead of like 14. I think that would help a lot with making raiding more profitable. And it would also encourage the big alliances to just spend more of their shit. Because right now they're just hoarding until Judgment Day and the trumpets sound. And part of the issue with that too is if you hoard like tens of millions of manufactured resources and all this money, you're incentivized to fight like 9-month or 2-year wars to use up all those resources and defeat your opponents and get ahead economically. Because if both sides have an infinite war chest, then you're never able to do economic damage to them. Like it's meaningless. You're fighting over peanuts in globals, which to some extent is starting to happen. Yeah, you can get rolled afterwards and lose everything. That yeah, UPN that happened to, Pantheons happened to. TS, I don't think it wasn't being cowardly by trying to avoid losses. I think it was just very aware, overly aware of how bad they could be. Paperless is a very interesting strategy. Paperless is extremely ideological. Um, how do I put it? Paperless, if you, if the paperless community, which is all the pirate alliances and more independent alliances, are all very healthy and cooperate, then what ends up happening is it's like having an ODP block. Oh, it's like having an ODP block where everyone can work together on things and then also like not work together on others. So it's way more fluid and way more interesting. So it's good for the game and it's also good for what's it called? Because the alliances have to manage their relationships and maintain them actively, otherwise they just deteriorate. So Paperless is good and it can work, but whenever there's a hegemony, like TS formed in Syndisphere, or IQ is trying to form an IQ, or TKR sort of formed in EMC, whenever those hegemony or eclipses probably going to attempt at some point in the future, or TKR tried with Hollywood, whenever those groups form, then they always snuff out the pirate alliances and the paperless alliances. They either murk them to no end, or they have the pirate alliances, the paperless alliances fight each other to ruin their relationships, or something else, because they don't want them around to compete. Because paperless alliances are pretty bad for yeah, hegemons. Yeah, paperless alliances are a lot quicker to realize a threat and to try and deal with it. And they're much more willing to fight than other blocks. Yeah, Enterprise is on red or something, I think, or some random other color that they use to farm treasures, and not tank green. Sitting on green to stack beige. I mean, there's such a. If you're raiding, sure, not a bad plan. If you're trying to make money, my suggestion would probably be join an alliance. The color trade blocks aren't like that big a deal. And there are ways to get under green, like without joining TS. Yep. So that hopefully that answers a bunch of questions. If I missed any, let me know. Let's try and review. I think that'd be a good idea. I did not intend to read the whole document, but it was pretty interesting. Okay, so what's the character of TS? What is the spirit of this alliance? What animates it? I think a big part of it is that they were the alliance that won. They won the game when they formed Syndisphere. They won, I think, the longest streak of global wars of any alliance except for their allies. They changed the game materially, economically, militarily, politically, and they helped distinguish it from CN in a big way. So, yeah, they are the alliance that won, but they are also the alliance that lost. They lost their identity for a little bit there. They lost a lot of their momentum, and I think they're still an elitist alliance. They're still the elite alliance. It's how they portray themselves. It's on their alliance page. It's an invite-only alliance on the Green Sphere. Most prominent and most influential. Unsolicited applications are not accepted. So they're still an elitist alliance. but they're not as elitist as they were. Right, they're 150 people now. They're not small. And I think the elitism didn't help them because it showed their age, right? That they're more traditionalists now. When they came to PNW, they were probably the ones with big ideas. But now alliances like Rose, even TKR to some extent, TI, TFP, these alliances are newer, they're trying more things. So TS isn't the innovator it once was. So which is, I think that's kind of a cool character, if you really think about it. That they, how to word it? It's like, yeah, the young idealist becomes sort of the grizzled veteran. I think that's somewhat of the character, which is interesting. And hopefully, as the government changes, I think they just brought a bunch of old people back, which doesn't help with we're trying to revitalize them too much. But hopefully they change things up. They become more interesting. They solve some of the problems which threaten to disband the alliance again, which I think has happened quite a number of times over the past few years. They've considered disbanding quite a lot, according to third parties that I hear from. So, yeah, it would be kind of a tragedy to see TS disband and nothing remains in its wake. But if they did, then and they split into like 2 or 3 other smaller alliances, that might also just make a really dynamic and interesting mid tier. So, I don't know. Either way, it works. TS is money. That is their theme. We didn't talk about some of their characteristics, I guess, in the sense that, like, what TS does. So TS is well known for its public diplomacy, for its not aggressive diplomacy. That's the wrong word, but proactive would be a word. Proactive rather than reactive. So it goes in with like the cult of personality and attacking their rivals really fiercely and condemning and denouncing players, but also just like forming narratives and pushing those narratives publicly. Whereas a group like Rose is way more subtle and does things through back channels. Like TS is starting to do that now, more so, but in the past they didn't. In the past it was way more public, and the strategies used to contrast each other really well, because both strategies could be performed at a very high level, and they sort of balanced each other out. Both alliances could succeed despite being very different. And over time, they've become more similar as TS sort of abandons the public diplomacy. And I think part of that is because a member of KT made a brilliant thread talking about the toxicity in TS. And it went from being good politics and narratives, I think, with some bad elements, to being predominantly bad elements and toxicity. And then I think if they tried to go back to more of just crafting the story and sharing it with people, that would actually help the game a lot. Because right now the game has no good stories. People don't argue them like they used to, and people aren't engaged by the stories that are present all that much. But they need to do that while also tempering their worst elements and avoiding becoming extremely toxic, which, in what's his name, Zed's words, they all want to do. Or want to do. Is there anything else that's worth mentioning? I think the thing with these history documents also is that, like, when I'm reading them, I'm being more critical in the sense that, like, I feel like they're misleading in some instances, or that I disagree, but I don't really have the time to fully explain why I disagree. Um, and maybe what I should be doing is, instead of doing a full read of their history, is making notes and then going through the history beat by beat, with what I think is relevant. Like I like that it's raw, and then you get my initial take. But I also tend to feel that it's not. Yeah, it's not great. It takes forever too. I'll have a think on it. I might do one more like this because I think TKR also has a really long history document, and then I don't think most other alliances do. So I'll just do the main beats. So I'll probably do another one which is longer, and then it will be all like 20-30 minute videos where I just capture the essence of like what happened in that alliance. And most of the alliances that are outside of like these three, their histories are actually kind of boring, or they're more recent, and that means there's less detail. Because in recent histories, they don't have as much leaks or people that disclose stuff. So yeah, and also just generally politics is less dense nowadays than it was back then. Like in Trail of Tears, he went through a whole section on like how the peace happened and how each alliance ended and everything else. And you can't do that for a modern war because everyone joined because of like two alliances deciding it, and then they peaced because of two alliances deciding it. I should interview some non-alliance members. If you find any, I'll do it. We'll see. I think that's what we'll call it. So yeah. End of stream. I will turn this off in like a couple minutes because I know that when I turned it off last time, it cut me off. So yeah. And yep, 100%. Become City 30, lead the non-alliance nun people, take them to rank 1, and then storm Sheepy and defeat the game itself.